Good morning. Before we start, let's bow our heads in a moment of prayer. Our Father, we are so thankful that we are here today to continue to study your word. We're thankful for our church and our pastor and those people who are here this morning. We ask blessings upon those who are stricken by the pandemic, either through relationships or sick in the hospital. We ask that you bless the servicemen and women who are spread throughout the country. We ask that you watch over and encourage the health workers and those who are under a lot of stress today. Please be with us here this morning as we study the book of Amos. In thy name we pray. Amen. Well, we're in our last lesson of Amos. Mary and I had a great time in Florida, as we were talking about before. Got a chance to really bond with the grandkids and actually feel like we were part of the family instead of just visiting grandparents. In reviewing Amos, as we said early on when we began the study, there were three sections of Amos that you could easily divide the book into. The first section was chapters 1 and 2, mostly persecution of the nations. Then there were judgment speeches and woe oracles in chapters 3 through 6. And so this morning we're talking about, again, periods of judgment. Seems like we never get out of that with the prophets, but you got to remember that the prophets were there to point out the sins of the country so that they would see their way back to the law. And so chapters 7 through 9, there are 5 visions that we're going to be talking about. And in the first 2 visions, God promises judgments through locusts and drought. And we've said before that he often sends natural things as the judgment. Then he uses the visions of a plumb line and a bowl of ripe fruit. And finally, he talks to us from beside or above an altar. But in between the second and the third and the fourth visions, we have a confrontation between the high priest of the king, Amaziah, and Amos. And it's a pretty nasty conversation because Amaziah, the priest, is sticking up for his king and telling basically Amos to go back to the country that he came from. Remember, he is preaching at the center of religion in Israel, and he's from Judah. We've said before that Amos didn't write the book. It actually is a compilation of his speeches passed down through oral tradition. So the vision reports in chapter 7 and 9 give us some insight into how that's created. We suspect, scholars suspect, that the first 6 chapters of Amos came down as a collection. And then the visions, the 5 visions in chapter 7 through 9, are another collection, and they were melded together. And then at some point later on, the confrontation between Amaziah and Amos are stuck in between the visions by yet a third person. Now, like most of our Bible, the process of developing a book from oral tradition is a really complicated process. It involves the passing down of oral traditions from generation to generation. It takes somebody to put it all together. Those pass downs were some from actual witnesses to Amos's speeches and his preaching. Others were people who knew that the collected works were part of Amos's speeches, and so those subsequent generations kind of added that stuff together. Then it took somebody who could read and write and took those oral traditions and wrote them down. We talked somewhat about this in the study of Ezra and Nehemiah and how the Old Testament really was kind of put together from the same sort of process. So this is not new, but sometimes the construct of the Bible, of the book itself, gives us some insight into how this was done. And this book of Amos is a good example. Now, the life of a prophet was not easy. They had to stay close enough to God to hear his words and be able to share them with the people. And on the other hand, he had to be with the people to whom he was ministering, and those people typically didn't want to hear his message. So no wonder some prophets like Moses and Jeremiah wanted to quit their job. Amos had two struggles. He had one struggle with God and one struggle with authorities, especially the king and his priests, which we'll read about here shortly. In his struggle with God, Amos was a true patriot who loved God, and he also loved his nation. So it grieved him that he had to tell both Judah and Israel that judgment was coming. Amos's first vision is of locusts. They are poised to attack the second crop. Evidently, the farmers in those days would plant two crops. They would plant the first crop early in the spring, and they would harvest that, and that belonged to the king. Then they would plant the second crop and harvest that, and that's how they lived and were able to subsist. So these locusts are poised to come out and devour the second crop, which would mean that the farmers would not have any food for their families. Amos agonized for his people, as God's plan was to strip their fields of food. And so Amos prays that God will call off the judgment, which he does. We've seen people before argue with God. Abraham argued with God. Moses talked with God. So many of the prophets have argued with God because they're conflicted between support for the people and what God has ordered them to do. So we're going to open up in chapter 7 of Amos, and we'll talk about the first, as soon as I find it. It's and we'll read the first 3 verses, I believe it is, which is the first vision, chapter 7. And I'm reading from The Voice, so it may be different than your translation. This is what the Lord showed me. He brought me a swarm of locusts when the crops had begun to sprout in late spring, after the king's portion of the hay had been cut. When I saw the locusts devour everything green in the land that belonged to the farmers, I spoke. Amos says to God, God, please forgive us. How will Jacob's descendants survive this? The nation is so small. Then God relented and showed mercy. God says, what you have seen will not be. In other words, the locusts will not devour the land. Then Amos has a second vision, which is that of a drought. In our Bible, it's called a rain of fire. Amos cries out again to the Lord, and once more, God relents. And so, verses 4 through 6. Then the Lord showed me this. He called for a rain of fire, and it devoured the deep abyss and began to devour the land itself. Amos says, prays to God, Lord, please no, not this. How will Jacob's descendants survive this? The nation is so small. And then God again relented and showed mercy. And God says, this will not happen either. Well, in Amos's third version, he sees a plumb line. Now, everybody knows what a plumb line is, right? I have a little picture of a plumb line. That, right? We use plumb lines to measure how straight a wall is. If you're hanging a picture, sometimes it's good to use a plumb line to make sure that it's straight. Well, God's plumb line was his law, and so he measures his people against the law. Are they adhering to his word? Are they of upright character and conduct? And as he finds, as we already know, that they are out of plumb and therefore must be destroyed. It's kind of an interesting way to measure measure the people's reaction to the law. So God says he will not spare them this time. He will destroy all of their high places and their sanctuaries where they worship contrary to God's law. Now remember, Israel's king, Jeroboam II, was a descendant of the first king, Jeroboam, when the monarchy was split. So when Solomon laid down his crown and picked it up, his son Rehoboam had the south, and he made some foolish decisions, and it angered the 10 tribes to the north. And Jeroboam, who was not a descendant of David, so we have kings in the north who are not descendants of David, take charge. And he didn't want his people going back to Jerusalem to attend the feasts and worship and offer sacrifices. So what he did was he created his own religion, a kind of, excuse the word, bastardized form of what was being worshiped in the south. So he created 2 worship centers, one in Dan up north and one in Bethel down south, and that's where Amos is preaching. And he also created a priesthood, not of Aaron descent as required by the law, but ones that he appointed. So they are in violation of all kinds of law just by the religion that Jeroboam originally established. Well, this religion has continued along with the worship of Baal, B-A-A-L, which is a Canaanite god. And when we get to the study of Hosea, we'll talk some more about Baal. So God is measuring the nation of Israel's people using a plumb line of his word and his law, which they have seriously violated. So we're in chapter 7 again, verses 7 through 9. Then he showed me this. The Lord was standing by a wall built with a plumb line, and in his hand was a plumb line. What do you see, Amos? God said. Amos says, a plumb line. God says, watch what I'm about to do. I'm going to put a plumb line up against my people Israel to see what is straight and true. And I will not look the other way any longer. The high places of Isaac will be destroyed, and the worship and the religious shrines of Israel will be reduced to ruin. Now, when he talks about the high place of Isaac, before Jerusalem was established as a center of worship, and before those laws were enacted, there were places where the patriarchs worshiped God and set up altars. And many of those were revered and would not have been a bad thing, except that they used these high places not to praise the Lord, but to conduct sacrifices, which were against the law, and to worship other deities, which was obviously against the law. And so God says that these high places and this new sanctuary, the temple that the king has set up in Bethel, will be destroyed. And so I continue, it says, and with sword in hand, I will bring down the house of Jeroboam the king. So he is going to, if he's preaching sedition, really. The vision says that the king will be brought down, the king will be destroyed, all his sanctuaries that he is touted as part of his established nation's religion will be destroyed. So that doesn't and wouldn't make any king very happy, and in particular this king is not. So now Amos struggles with authority. So he's a patriot. he doesn't want his nation to suffer, and so he struggles with God in what God intends to do. And now he's faced with another struggle, and that is with the authorities. God has told Amos that he would destroy the king, the main sanctuary at Bethel, the king's chapel, and that King Jeroboam would be slain. Well, at Bethel, Amos attacked both the government and the nation's religion. That's not for the faint-hearted. You wouldn't go to the center of power and say these things without some trepidation. The first message we read in the next verses is Amaziah's report to the king. Amaziah is the high priest in the nation of Israel, and he's been appointed by the king as priest. The next message we read in the scriptures is Amaziah's words to Amos. Now, the king wouldn't want to hear that his chapel and his shrines would be destroyed, that he would die, and that his people would be exiled by the Assyrians. The priest's message to Amos was pretty nasty. He suggests that Amos is a coward, told him to leave Israel, and suggested that Amos was only interested in earning a living by saying such outrageous things. Then Amos responds to Amaziah, and he says he will not be intimidated or run away. He counters that he is a prophet called by God. In Judah, he did not work as a prophet, and we know that he was a farmer, and he raised herds. Then Amos proclaims God's word and the judgments that will follow. Now, Amaziah had position, he had wealth, he had reputation, but Amos had God's words. Amaziah served the king of Israel, but Amos served the King of Kings, so we know who is going to win in this confrontation. Still, it's not an easy thing for a prophet like Amos and many of the prophets who said things that the ruling monarch did not like. We know that, for example, Elijah ran when Jezebel was Ahab and Jezebel were on the throne, and he ran all the way from Mount Carmel up near Lebanon all the way down to close to Egypt because he was afraid of being killed. So this is no different for Amos, but Amos stands his ground. So I'm in Amos chapter 7, verse 10. And this is the confrontation between Amaziah and Amos. Then Amaziah the priest at the royal shrine in Bethel sent word to Jeroboam, the king of Israel. So this is what Amaziah says to the king. Amos is plotting conspiracy against you in the very heart of the land of Israel. You must act. The land cannot bear any more of his speeches, for this is what Amos is saying. Amos says, Jeroboam, this is what Amos is saying, repeated by Amaziah. Jeroboam is going to die by the sword, and the people of Israel will be captured and led away into exile far from home. Then Amaziah says, I told Amos, listen, seer, run for the land of Judah, earn your living and spread your prophecies there, but don't ever show your face and try to prophesy at Bethel again, because this is the king's sanctuary and a temple for his kingdom. But Amos persisted. Amos says, I am not a professional prophet or even the son of one. You shouldn't be afraid of me. I am just a man who followed my herds and gathered fruit from the sycamores until God spoke to me as I was minding my flock. God said, go and speak my words to the people of Israel. So now listen to what God has to say to you who say, don't prophesy against Israel or predict the downfall of Isaac's descendants. God says this, and so Amos delivers another message. Your wife will be reduced to selling herself in the streets. Your sons and daughters will die by the sword. Your land will be measured out to others. You yourself will end your days in an impure land, and Israel will be sent into exile far from home. That's pretty strong words coming from the prophet, and we know that many of the prophets suffered from the words of truth that they spoke as delivered to them from God. So then we get into the fourth vision. This prophecy in itself has often been described as speaking truth to power. Amos chose to speak of God's judgment at the center of power in Israel. He would have the last word. God would have the last word. Amos has a fourth vision. It's just like God to encourage his servants just after they've been through rough times. And so here God uses a common basket of ripe fruit to teach an important spiritual truth. Just as the basket of fruit was ripe for eating, the nation of Israel was ripe for judgment. There comes a time when God's long-suffering ends and judgment is decreed. And so I'm in chapter 8. This is what the eternal God says to me, showed to me, a basket of ripe fruit. What do you see, Amos? God says. Amos says, I see a basket of ripe fruit. God responds, the time is ripe for the end of my people Israel. I will not overlook their wrongdoing any longer. On that day, the joyous songs sung in the temple will be turned to wailing and crying, and dead bodies will be piled up everywhere, scattered here, scattered there. Silence, says the eternal Lord. Well, God now explains why the end is coming. It's pretty simple. Israel has broken God's law and failed to live up to his covenant. They did not love God, and the injustice in the land meant they did not love their neighbor. So we know from the New Testament, Christ, two important words, right? If you could summarize the law, love the God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor. And Amos says, Israel, you failed to do both of those. And so I'm in chapter 8, verse 4. Listen to this, you who trample on the needy and bring poor to ruin, who ask, when will the new moon festival be done so we can sell our grain? And when will the Sabbath end so we can sell our wheat? So they're belittling those holy festivals. Then we can tamper with our scales and make the bushel measure smaller and the counterweight heavier to cheat our customers. We can buy the needy for silver and the poor and their property for the price of the sandals. We can even sell the chaff we sweep up as grain. So they're cheating, and as the pastor said this morning, it's a combination of, as he said, knowing what we know about the word and melding that with societal issues. And so what has happened, because Israel has failed to follow the word of God, failed to follow the covenant, they've also belittled societal responsibilities. So the scales are not fair. The courts are not fair. Poor people, when they can't pay their debts, are sold into slavery. And so God is adamant that it's gone far enough. Amos then hears God describe how the end will come. And many of this sounds like our study of Revelation. As the trumpets and the bowls poured out their wrath, you remember a lot of the things that happened were physical to the earth. And so in this description, it's very similar. Ezekiel had kind of the same sort of ideas of how the end time will come. Amos talks about an earthquake. And we know that Amos referred to an earthquake in Amos chapter 1, verse 1. And we know that it was pretty broadly, we know that one occurred because archaeologically we found evidence of earthquakes, destruction without fire, which would meant that buildings collapsed. If there's fire involved, then that usually means there's a battle, and that's the reason for and they found evidence of earthquake from Hazor up north all the way down south. So we know it was a major earthquake in the Middle East, but we don't know the earthquake that's mentioned in chapter 8, if that's what Amos was talking about. He also said there would be darkness, perhaps an eclipse. All the joyful feasts that normally happen will turn into a funeral. And finally, there'll be famine, both physical famine and spiritual famine. Spiritual famine because God will no longer talk to the people. And so, again, I'm in Amos chapter 8, verse 7. God has sworn by the pride of Jacob the very land he gave to them. And God says, I will not forget anything that Israel has done. Won't the land beneath their feet tremble for this, and everyone who lives in it mourn? The ground will rise and fall like the river Nile, which floods and recedes. It will ripple and roll like the current of the Egypt's Nile. So, in other words, describing an earthquake. And God says, on that day I will make the sun set at noon and send darkness across the earth when it should be broad daylight. And I will turn your celebrations into mourning and all your singing into wailing. And I will make it so that all wearing mourning sackcloth, in other words, a funeral, and every head is shaved out of sadness. It will be like the grief you feel at the death of an only child, and it will be bitter day by end. And God says, the days are coming when I will send a famine on the land, not a hunger for food or thirst of water, but starvation for the words of the Lord. People will stagger from the Dead Sea to the Mediterranean Sea, from the north to the east. They will run everywhere, desperate to hear the voice of the Eternal One, and they will not hear it. When that time comes, beautiful young women and strong young men will fall from thirst. And those who swear by the pagan idols of Samaria, who say, as your God lives, Dan, referring to the temple in Dan, or as your power lives, the Beersheba, will all fall, never to rise again. So that's 4 visions. After vision 2, it's been interrupted by this confrontation with Amaziah the priest. So in our last vision, Amos shares 4 affirmations from God. 3 deal with judgment, and the last one with hope and mercy. And I want to mention this again, and I will continue to mention it in every study of the minor prophets, and probably if we looked at the major prophets, they too, but every study of the minor prophets doesn't end without a message of restoration and hope. And oftentimes that message of restoration and hope involves the coming of a Messiah, a descendant of David, and the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. Exactly what we read about in the book of Revelation. So Amos sees God in this vision standing by an altar, announcing that the worshipers will be slain when the building is destroyed and falls on them. He's talking about the worshipers at the temple in Bethel. God will track down all idolatrous worshipers and bring judgment to them no matter where they run. And so, chapter 9, first 4 verses. I looked and saw the Lord standing by the altar. Strike the tops of the pillars so that the foundations shake, and cut them off so that the building crashes down upon the heads of all the people. Again, he's talking about the king's temple in Bethel. I will kill with the sword any who survive. Not one of them will get away, not one of them will escape. If they dig down to the land of the dead, my hand will find them and pull them back up. If they try to climb to heaven, I will bring them back down there. If they try to hide on the summit and in the dense forests of Mount Carmel, I will track them down and capture them. If they try to disappear from sight in the depths of the sea, I will send a sea monster to bite and devour them. If they are taken captive by their enemies, I will command that they be killed by the sword in their exile, and I will fix my gaze upon them, not for their good, but for their harm. So when the Lord says he's going to track you down all the way from heaven to hell and in the land, from enemies and from the sea, you better pay attention. Interesting that Amos calls God, quote, the Lord of the armies of heaven and earth 9 times in his book. The essence of the idolatry of Israel's people was that they created their own gods, as I mentioned earlier, and they held such a low view of God, the God of the universe, that they thought that he would approve of their actions. It's interesting how leadership, and this is very prominent in our society today, how leadership can influence the thoughts and minds of people in the country. And so when Jeroboam the first created this new worship center and created all these priests, it probably at first upset the people because they were used to going to Jerusalem and worshiping. But once he got that started, after 2 or 3 kings who supported it, and priests, and the propaganda that was that took place, they now feel that it's okay to worship the way they did. It's okay not to take their sacrifices to Jerusalem. It's okay to worship these other gods because the one true God is lenient. He's okay with that stuff. And that's not true. We know that. Amos now reminds the people how great God really is, the one and only true God. That God creates and controls the universe and is the God of history who claimed them as his people. And so I'm in chapter 9, verse 5. God, commander of heavenly armies, he touches the earth and it cracks and crumbles, and everyone upon it cries with grief. He touches the land and it rises and falls like the Nile in Egypt. He builds his upper chambers in the heavens, and he founds his storeroom on the earth. He calls up the waters of the sea and pours them out across the land. God is his name. So he's reminding the Israelites who their God really is. To me, you aren't like the people of Ethiopia. He's talking about the nation of Cush, which was south of the nation of Egypt. Overwhelmed by the powers around you, you people of Israel, didn't I bring the people of Israel from the land of Egypt? And the Philistines from Caphtor, and the Arameans from Kir. Look, the eyes of the eternal Lord are fixed upon your sinful kingdom, and I will wipe it off the face of the earth. But I will not destroy Jacob's descendants completely. So there's another message of hope. In every piece of judgment, even in the book of Revelations, God says, I'm going to destroy the people who are evil, but I won't destroy everyone. There's always a remnant who still believe that God will save. He made a promise back early in the Old Testament to Abraham that his descendants will rule. He worked with Moses to rescue them from Egypt and establish them in a land that he promised. And he is not going to renege on that promise. So throughout all this judgment, throughout all the turmoil that takes place with Syria and Babylonia, even in today's environment, God will keep his promise. So that means that the nation of Israel, when God's final kingdom comes, has a special place. They will have a kingdom in the land that they currently occupy. It's kind of interesting to see how the Bible matches up with what we know in the world today. And so I'm in verse 9. I will give the order, God says, and I will shake the nation of Israel among all nations, the way grain is shaken in a sieve, and all the good kernels will fall to the ground. But the rocks will stay trapped in the sieve, ready for disposal. I will see all of my people who do wrong, who say nothing bad will ever happen to us. I will see them all fall to the sword. So he's going to sieve the nation, and he will not completely destroy the nation of Israel. He will always find a way to find the remnant who still believe. So after 9 chapters of ugly judgment, we get to perhaps the most important part of the book of Amos. Jehovah is the God of history who shows his great power to Israel at every turn, but he's also a God of mercy, thankfully, who will keep his covenant with Abraham and his descendants and not destroy the nation completely. The last words of Amos are words of restoration. So in contrast to destroying the chapel at Bethel, God will raise up the house of David. Remember the 2 major covenants. the covenant that God had with Abraham that was reinforced with Moses that says, I will be your God and you will be my people. And then there's the Davidic covenant that God promised that David's descendants will reign on the throne forever. And we know that in the New Testament, Christ was a descendant of David, and he will come again to reign on God's kingdom here on earth in the final days. So Israel is about to collapse from Assyria, and Babylon is on the horizon, but one day after, God will establish the kingdom that he promised. Amos ends his prophecy by promising that God will take Israel to be planted, protected, and never again pulled up from the land. So let's finish off the book of Amos, starting at verse 11. After that happens, on the day I choose, I will build the dilapidating house of David from its ruins. So it's a common theme among all the prophets that there will be a Messiah. And so you can see, even in Jesus' day, when the leaders and the Jewish people, they expected a Messiah at some point. And we talked over Advent about how Mary, when approached by Gabriel, was like a lot of Jewish women, hoping that someday they perhaps would be the mother of the Messiah. And so you can, once you read the prophets, you can see this promise of a Messiah, somebody who would come from the line of David to rule in a kingdom forever. Now, they sort of twisted that during Jesus' day. They expected that kingdom to overcome the Romans. But we know from reading the scriptures, and especially the New Testament, that that kingdom will be a kingdom on earth, and sometime in the future when Christ returns a second time. So let me continue. Mend the holes in it, in the house that he's talking about, rebuild its wreckage, and restore it just the way it used to be. So he's talking about the kingdom of David. Then they may possess what remains of Edom, including every person among the outsiders who have been called by my name. So he's talking about not just the Jews, but he's talking about all the nations. When it says including every person among the outsiders, meaning those who are not circumcised, who have been called by my name. So says the Eternal One who would make this happen. God says, the day is coming when the one following will overtake one ahead, when the person plowing the field will overtake the person still reaping the grain from last season, when the person stomping grapes will overtake the person planting the vineyard. And in that fertile day, new wine will drip from the mountains, and the hills will flow with it. I will restore the captives of my people Israel. They will rebuild their ruined cities and return them. They will plant new vineyards and drink wine from them, and they will plant new gardens and eat the food they grow. I will plant them in their own soil, and they will never be uprooted again. For this is the land I've given them. So said the Eternal One, your God. So, let me see if I can conclude our study. When you read Amos, it's not surprising that it could be very frightening. But it's something that every Christian needs to hear. It was exactly what Israel needs to hear. Now, as I repeat the things that Amos said about the nation of Israel, insert the church in those words. Amos brought a message against spiritual complacency. The church needs to worry about spiritual complacency. Israel did all the religious things, but none of the God-pleasing things. They play-acted their religion nicely, but did not follow God. They forgot about love and justice and mercy and compassion. If you look at today's society, you can see that in every headline in the newspaper, that we've kind of lost this ability to agree but disagree and still love our neighbors. They forgot about obedience to the covenant. They forgot about servanthood and humility and the sacrifice of themselves for the blessing of others. When was the last time you saw someone give of themselves in order to help somebody else? Everybody seems to be out for themselves. Everybody seems to be selfish. So most of Amos's prophecy announced doom against Israel and Judah and her neighbors. But in these last verses that we just read, God promises to reinstate David's dynasty with a Messiah and to restore God's people to their land and to establish God's kingdom here on earth for all believers. So it's kind of like the plum in the pudding, right? It's kind of like the good thing among all the bad things, that Israel brought all of this stuff on themselves by failing to follow God's word, and God has just had enough. And we know historically what happens next, that Assyria comes in and takes over the country of Israel. Later, Babylon comes in and beats Syria and eventually takes over the country of Judah and destroys the city and the temple. And the people are exiled to Babylon, where they spent 70 years. And then God raises up Cyrus and sends the Jews, the remnant that he promises to save, back to their land, and they rebuild the city and they rebuild the temple, which lasts all the way into Jesus' day. Herod improves upon the temple, and it becomes a very wondrous structure, but it's all glamour. That the things that Christ talks to the Jewish leadership about when he comes to the earth is that, you're the same complacent people that we had back in the judgment day of Amos, that you're going through the rituals. You don't care about people. And that's one reason why Christ drew such large crowds, was because he cared about people. And then Christ dies, is resurrected, and the promise of resurrection and the promise of the kingdom to come is again talked about in the New Testament as a reflection of the prophets' forecast in the Old Testament. And so today, we're waiting for the second coming of Christ, for the promises of the Old Testament, including Amos, to come to us when Christ returns and God establishes his kingdom here on earth. I think a great lesson and a great book. And next week, we'll start with Hosea. God asks prophets to do a lot of crazy things. He asked Jeremiah to wear a yoke like an oxen. He asked Ezekiel to lay on his side for over 300 days, on his left side. Just some really crazy things. Well, one of the things that is probably most crazy is what he asked Hosea to do, and we'll talk about that next Sunday. Let's bow our heads for our closing prayer. Father God, thank you for the lesson today. May we take the words of Amos and make them pertinent in our own society and in our own culture and as part of our church. For your word is forever lasting and available for all of us to learn. Be with each and every one of us as we go about our week, and bring us back again safely next Sunday. In thy name we pray. Amen.